Hey, Upstream listeners. Today we're releasing a conversation I had at the end of 2024 with Marc Andreessen for Turpentine's show, Moment of Zen. This wide-ranging discussion covers the new administration, why San Francisco is the cultural center of the universe, why Elon Musk keeps winning, and much more. Please enjoy. Marc, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Hey, Eric, it's great to be back.
So first question, Marc, are you tired of all the winning? All the appointments, all the timeline splitting, the preference falsification, even the Democrats you talk to are secretly happy. Are you tired of winning?
I was told there would be so much winning that we would all get tired of winning. And I have to say, so far, I am not, in fact, tired of winning.
Amazing. I mean, if you compare it to, I remember the days of 2020 when every day we would say, this is the craziest thing, that we've ever seen. Every day is the new craziest thing we've ever seen. And just the constant black pilling. And now it's just white pill central.
The unwind of this whole thing of this last 4 years is just spectacular. And, it's just getting started. So my favorite thing that happened today.
Yeah.
Okay. So I like to say that every single day I see something that's just so crazy that I literally blank it out of my mind that I saw it and I forget about it.
Yeah.
And then I'm scrolling Twitter, I'm scrolling X like half an hour later and I see it again. And I'm like, no, that can't be right. And I forget about it again. And then like 3 hours later, I'm scrolling again. I said, there it is. It's the third time that it sticks in my head. The Commerce Secretary of the Biden administration gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal published today in which she said she really believes that the key to beating China in the great geopolitical contest of the 21st century is to out-innovate them.
Okay. Wow.
This after 4 years of her administration did everything possible to do the exact opposite.
Yeah. It's
a cynic would say that she's looking for work.
Yeah.
I, however, am very idealistic, and I think she's being genuine in her sentiments.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. I remember Matt Iglesias was talking about sort of a new agenda for the Democrats recently, and I remember David Sachs quote tweeted him and was like, "Sounds like you're a Republican."
These guys literally, as I say, there's a set of these guys, some of whom are friends of yours.
Yes.
Who are all like, ooh, like we have to stand for building things after 50 years of standing for the exact opposite.
Yeah. But only Democrats can do it.
It's really some incredible stuff. No, look, I mean, this is you tell me what you think of this. This is the most spectacular unwind of what we refer to as preference falsification that I've ever seen. Like it feels like every day. In the last month now, or coming on 6 weeks, every day literally is like a whole block of people basically coming out and saying the exact opposite from what they've been saying for the preceding 10 years. And let's be generous. I genuinely believe that they actually believe it. They just feel like that they can say it now for the first time. And by the way, I think this process, there has been so much preference falsification in the last decade. I think this process, the unwind is at the very beginning. I think we're like 1% of the way there. And right. I'm really, really interested to see how far this thing rips.
Yeah. So let's flesh this out a little bit. What has there been preference falsification about? So within tech, there was a lot of sort of the DEI stuff, the activism stuff, a lot of these sort of moral panics over the last few years that people had to sort of pay lip service to. There's a lot of the COVID stuff. There's a lot of just hiding sort of incompetence or flesh out. What was really the preference falsification that is being sort of, shifted now?
Yeah, well, as you know, so there are two components to preference falsification. And for the people hearing this for the first time, this is the work of a professor named Timur Kuran, who is really outstanding, very sharp, and wrote a book years ago called Private Truths, Public Lies, where he lays out basically this theory of preference falsification, which is basically what happens in a society in which people basically have to lie in public. But it actually, and this is the private truths, public lies, kind of part. But it turns out there's two parts to the theory. There's the part where you think something and you're not allowed to say it. And then there's the part about how you don't think something, but you must say it anyway.
Yeah.
And so, the classic example, Václav Havel, the great Czech statesman, anti-communist, wrote a similar book 40 years ago called The Power of the Powerless before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he talked about basically in totalitarian communist states, the slogan was workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And he writes this whole book about basically how everybody under a communist regime basically didn't believe any of that, right? Like certainly by the 1970s, 1980s, they didn't believe any of the workers of the world were not going to unite. They were not going to lose their chains, right? And in fact, the chains were coming from a completely different source, which was the communist dictatorship. But Timur Kuran talks a lot about the need for everybody to profess this. Like, everybody has to lie. Everybody knows that everybody's lying. Everybody knows that everybody knows is lying, and yet everybody is still lying, right?
Yeah.
And actually what happens in the extreme is it becomes what you call a demoralization campaign, right? So it's a specific psychological method used by totalitarian societies to basically grind everybody's psychology into the ground. Like what Havel talked about is you lose all of your self-respect. Like you lose your humanity when you're put in a position like that. Now, of course, in our society, we don't live under anything, nearly as extreme as like Soviet communism, but nevertheless, we have been living for the last decade under what I refer to as a soft authoritarian version of this, where the social dynamics are as intense. And then the penalty is not you get sent to the gulag. The penalty is you get canceled. And when you get canceled, you lose your livelihood, you lose your employment opportunities. In many cases, we both know people who've lost friends, have lost family.
Yeah.
And, some people who literally have like vanished off the face of the earth and not been heard from again. And then every once in a while, somebody commits suicide. Yeah. And so it's a soft version of a hard dictatorship, but it's nevertheless, it's deeply authoritarian. And then the nature of it is, if you talk about it, you get in trouble. Right. And so, and this is the thing that's happening now, which is like, whoa, well, wait a minute. Like, what do you mean? Like, who got canceled? And it's like, well, there was a decade of scalps nailed to the wall, and now we're just going to pretend it didn't happen. So that's the general thing. I think at this point, simply saying that this is the regime that we've been living under, I think makes it crystal clear. I think everybody listening to this will have their own example. Again, their own example, either of something that they believed but couldn't say, or there's something that they didn't believe that they were forced to say. Both sides of that are incredibly pernicious. Maybe it's a tribute to the flexibility of an actual democratic society that this kind of pressure campaign can only stay on so long. But, boy, it certainly seems to be cracking now.
Yeah. And just one example, you tweeted about how you regretted not speaking up publicly for the former, I believe, CEO of Mozilla, Brendan Eich, who made a personal donation that was controversial at the time and got him fired. But the cost of speaking up and standing up for him might have, yielded some controversy as well. And so it feels like a lot of people are sort of realizing, hey, there were these people sort of canceled. I should have spoke up for them. Now I can, now that it's safe.
Yeah, so that was a really key moment, and we should talk about that just because it was so key. And so this was one of the first, kind of cancellation campaigns in tech. This was about 10 years ago. And in retrospect, this kind of was the firing of the starting gun for a lot of what followed. But it was, I would say just for myself, it was deeply confusing at the time, what was happening. And so basically what happened was, this guy's name is Brendan Eich. He's a longtime friend of mine. He's a guy that we recruited to my first company, Netscape, in like 1994. He actually, this is true, single-handedly created JavaScript. Like he literally sat down over the summer and like wrote it himself, which is now, the most popular programming language on the planet. And so one of these incredible seminal figures in our industry, and also just like a wonderful human being, super nice guy, very community-oriented, family-oriented, super warm, always there for people. Everybody loved this guy. He was a key engineer at Netscape in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, after we sold Netscape to AOL, they, at that point, spun off the Mozilla Foundation to turn what had been the Netscape browser into open source, which created ultimately Firefox and a lot of the work that team has done since. Brendan was one of two people who, really led that spinoff. And at the time, I was very happy to help them do that. Fast forward to, I think it was, Eric, you'll remember this, like 2013 or 2014. Mm-hmm. There was all of a sudden this like massive blow up at the Mozilla Foundation at his workplace, which he was the CEO of at the time. And basically there was this kind of rediscovery that in, I think 2008, he had given a $1,000 donation to a California ballot proposition that was in opposition to legalizing gay marriage in California. And just to set the stage for this, I was pro-gay marriage way before then. I actually supported Gavin Newsom in 2004 when he was mayor of San Francisco, because he was the earliest, that was the first city in which gay marriage happened in the U.S. And so, this at the time was not my politics, but Brendan did this in 2008. What's interesting about that is that the ballot proposition in 2008 that Brendan donated to was the exact same policy that every major Democrat at that time was also advocating for. Right. And so the people who were anti-gay marriage in 2008, at the same time Brendan did this donation, included Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, a young woman soon to rise to prominence, Hillary Clinton, and even then elder statesman of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, right, as well as like every major, Democratic congressperson, senator, like basically there were effectively no Democrats other than Gavin who were pro-gay marriage at that time. And so for the crime of making a $1,000 donation to a cause that exactly mirrored the Democratic Party at the time it was made, he was blown to smithereens, like just completely nuked, right? And it was one of these, with the Khmer Rouge Bush used to call year zero phenomena, which is, as of 2014, everybody is all of a sudden greenlit to pretend that morality started in 2014, and that there was no history to any of these things and no backstory. And then therefore everybody is to be judged by the present moment, and nobody gets any grace. There's no hope of redemption. There's no hope of forgiveness. There's not even a chance to explain yourself. You were just like vaporized. And that happened to Brendan. Now, Brendan has since gone on to do many great things and has this incredible Project Brave and continues to be very successful. But he got blown right out of the organization that he had founded and was just like completely trashed at the time. And at the time, it was just like this weird, it was this thing, which is just like, like in a movie where there's a sudden car crash and you're just like, what the fuck just happened?
Yeah.
Right. And then your reaction afterwards is like, well, okay, thank God that's over. Right. That was weird. Like, certainly that will never happen again. And that was the foreshadowing. And that's, and I tweeted many years later, I said, one of the things I most actually regret in my life, certainly my professional life, and my life of being a friend, is not standing up publicly at that point. Because in retrospect, that was the very beginning of this wave that sort of metastasized throughout the industry. And hypothetically, if a bunch of us had stood up at that time, maybe we could have held off a lot of what followed.
Yeah. And so, but you're optimistic now that this reign of soft authoritarianism, aka sort of extreme wokeness, is over. Because there's a question of, hey, will it just come back again in 4 years, or now that Trump will take power, will they sort of summon the resistance, antibodies again? Or let's talk a little bit about your perspective on this.
Yeah, so I think that, like wokeness is over is a little bit too glib. And the main reason why that's the case, I think, maybe is self-evident, which is basically the bureaucracies of corporate America and of the government and of nonprofits, foundations, NGOs, schools, universities, the media companies, the press, basically the big bureaucracies, what we refer to as sort of the managerial class that sort of
the cathedral.
The cathedral, Curtis Yarvin's term, the cathedral, or James Burnham's term, the managerial class, the managers who sort of run everything. And by everything being like basically all of the large incumbent institutions. Like basically the wokeness has become standard policy, right? And like every large organization in the country, like the mandate number one is be compliant. Right. Like whatever is required to be compliant is like holy, right? It's like the thing that cannot be, you must be compliant. Like you must check off all the compliance boxes. Like whether you win or not in the market is kind of optional, but you must be compliant. Yeah. Whether you actually teach students anything is optional, but you must be compliant. And so, wokeness has become part of the compliance regime. Also what they refer to wonderfully, these great Orwellian terms, the risk management regime. It's incredible. The trust and safety regime.
Yeah.
It's, just take all these words and reverse them. So, this stuff has gotten wired very deeply, and then it's been well documented at this point that the foundation for a lot of what we call wokeness is actually baked deeply into the law, right? And a whole bunch of people have done, Richard Hanania and Jeannie Sutcliffe, great writer, and Christopher Caldwell and Wesley Yang have all done great work in kind of documenting kind of how deep this stuff is sort of embedded in the law, which is a whole other topic. And so there's an institutionalization that's taken place that's going to take, optimistically 30 years to get out or something like that. And by the way, maybe never. Having said that, there's that, but then there's what we've been dealing with for the last decade, which is beyond that, which is sort of the idea of wokeness being like the cultural vanguard, and basically being the thing that's like the coolest, highest status, highest fashion thing you can possibly be, and the thing that you have to be if you want to aspire to rise in the hierarchy and rise among the managerial class and run things, and then if you want to get like really good press coverage, and if you want people to think that you're a moral person. So kind of that whole thing. And then there's the power component of it. And this, I use the Tolkien metaphor here, the ring of power, which is the ability to call somebody a bad name under the wokeness regime and like instantly vaporize them and blow them out of their job and take their job. Like those second parts are like, I think, fading very fast. And in a lot of ways, it's sort of inevitable that would happen because it's just like in fashion, whatever is cool and trendy now looks dated 5 or 10 years later. And you wonder how people possibly could have worn bell bottoms or whatever. Like, it's that kind of phenomenon. And so there's no question, like the election basically punched a giant hole in the side of that balloon, and it's deflating incredibly quickly. And by the way, you see it in the reaction. You see it in the reaction to the election itself, which is there. This is like the polar opposite reaction to 2016, which is just like there's like a complete deflation taking place. And I think wokeness is losing altitude quickly. But let's come back to the legal part, because that's also there's some very interesting things that might happen there that we could also talk about.
Yeah. So say more. What do you have in mind?
Well, so if you wanted to pick like the most extreme possible like attorney to put in charge of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to sort of reverse DEI, it would be this lawyer named Harmeet Dillon, who's been a California lawyer who's been, the scourge of woke corporations for the last decade. As it happens, she has just been appointed to run the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And for the people who don't track this, the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department is the federal government, basically prosecutorial arm that basically enforces basically wokeness. They're the ones that basically have made sure for the last decade that all these companies have all these crazy policies under penalty of being investigated, subpoenaed, ultimately prosecuted. And by the way, there have been lots of prosecutions, lots of court cases. The most famous case that the current head of the Civil Rights Division brought was the case against SpaceX for not hiring enough refugees. Right. Notwithstanding that SpaceX is a military contractor and is not permitted to hire non-American citizens under a separate law. And so the person running that has been a true activist, as you'd expect from this last administration. And then Ms. Dillon, who, by the way, I don't know, but I've been following for years and is clearly brilliant. She's the exact opposite of that. And so every sort of signal is, I don't want to speak for this new administration, but every signal is being sent that they're going to basically do a 180 on all these things. And they are going to begin prosecuting companies for violations of civil rights laws in the form of reverse discrimination, which is to say discrimination against variously white people, Asians, Jews, and many other, the unprotected classes, as they say. Right. And so signals are being sent by the appointments that there is going to be an assault that's going to be the reverse of the assault that companies have been under and universities have been under. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, ruled not that long ago that private universities are not allowed to do race-based admissions. And it's actually really funny because there's some question as to whether, the demographic shift of admissions in the last year was starkly different than the year before as these institutions claim that they're coming in compliance with the Supreme Court. There's some question as to whether discovery would show that they're actually in compliance or whether they're still playing games. So that's another thing we may find out here. And then there's a very open question as to basically whether essentially de facto that decision already has been made or will be made for private companies as well. And there's a lot of private companies that have been trying to figure out quietly how to kind of dismount from DEI for actually both reasons, for legal reasons and for cultural reasons. And now there's another sort of very interesting thing that's kicking in, which is there I think are a lot of large companies where basically they were already basically done with DEI to start. They were done with DEI for their own reasons, which is, it's backfired in many spectacular ways. But now they have any large company that wants to dismount from it now has the best reason in the world, which is we need to be compliant. We right?
It's right? Illegal.
Because it's illegal. And by the way, let me just state for the record, I think every major corporation in the country is just in flagrant violation of actual written civil rights law. You cannot have these hard quotas and basically all these racially and ethnically and religiously biased, hiring. Right. It's just flat out illegal. And these companies basically all went so extreme on this that they ended up in what I think is clearly mass illegality. And so as Ms. Dillon kind of kicks in her job, let's say she's not going to lack for a shortage of targets. And so if you don't want to be a target, it is a great kind of, get out of jail free card to just voluntarily shut all this stuff down. And my guess is starting pretty quickly here. I mean, we're already starting to see it, right? So Boeing and a bunch of other, companies have already put a bullet in their programs. And even the University of Michigan, which kind of went completely bananas for this stuff, actually shut their whole thing down. So I think we're going to see my guess is we're going to see a run of companies that are going to take, quite dramatic action here.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Even if you think it's a bit overhyped, AI is suddenly everywhere. From self-driving cars to molecular medicine to business efficiency. If it's not in your industry yet, it's coming fast. But AI needs a lot of speed and computing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? Time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud. Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, plus all your AI and machine learning workloads. OCI costs 50% less for compute and 80% less for networking. So you're saving a pile of money. Thousands of businesses have already upgraded to OCI, including Vodafone, Thomson Reuters, and Suno AI. Right now, Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to OCI for new US customers with minimum financial commitment. Offer ends March 31st. See if your company qualifies for this special offer at oracle.com/turpentine. That's oracle.com/turpentine. Every time I hop on the 101 freeway in SF, I look up at the various tech billboards and think, damn, turpentine should definitely be up there. And I bet I'm not alone. In a world of endless scrolling and ad blockers, sometimes the most powerful way to reach people is in the real world. That's where Adquick comes in. The easiest way to book out-of-home ads, like billboards, vehicle wraps, and airport displays. The same way you would order an Uber. Started by Instacart alums, Adquick was born from their own personal struggles to book and measure ad success. Adquick's audience targeting, campaign management, and analytics bring the precision and efficiency of digital to the real world. Ready to get your brand the attention it deserves? Visit adquick.com today to start reaching your customers in the real world. Again, that's adquick.com.
University of Michigan, my alma mater, was doing events that were called non-POC only, like it's just whites only, but they non-POC as a way to it's just hilariously ridiculous.
Did they have their own drinking fountains?
Yeah, what's old is new.
Yeah,
well.
How do you literally? How do you end up resegregating in the name of racial? It's just the most extraordinary thing. It's the most extraordinary thing ever. It's what the whole civil rights, basically, war of the battle of the 1960s was about, was desegregation, right, and non-discrimination. And then how do you end up thinking you're on the moral high ground and you do that? And how do you end up thinking you're not breaking the law? Again, this is part of this sort of mass insanity of the preference falsification. And look, there are many lawyers and HR people who have been implementing these policies who are fully aware that they've been breaking the law. And so it's going to be very interesting to see the unwind.
There's the great Kovefe Annan idea that we sometimes talk about. The woke are more correct than the mainstream. And sort of, an example of that is it turns out, I guess we have been being systemically discriminatory or systemically racist, just not to not to the groups that just to Asians, or to groups that we didn't, particularly sort of think that we were.
Yes, systemic racism has been rather widespread. Yes, this is true.
Why do you think in 2024 there isn't as big of a response as there was in 2016? Is it just the movement is gone? Is it just that because it's the second time? Because a bunch of people were saying, hey, if Trump wins, you're gonna resummon the old sort of spirits of the crazy progressive left, but that's not, I hear actually the opposite. It seems like they're retreating or don't even exist anymore, or converting, or I guess, sort of on their, their own Gab and Parler, social networks, ghettos. No disrespect to Gab and Parler.
Blue sky.
Yeah, blue sky. Yeah, exactly. So why do you are you surprised by this, or why do you think this is?
By the way, I can't resist. My friend Jan LeCun has got so exercised over Elon and X after the election that he bailed on X, did this big. He's one of the leaders and geniuses, super geniuses in AI. But somebody at X today, basically pulled up a slide. As it goes with this OpenAI 03 release, and pulled up a slide from Jan saying that this would never work, and basically was like, Jan, you coward, come back here and fight me, on X. and Jan literally responded by screenshotting it and responding on LinkedIn, which I guess is now the other snowflake ghetto. If blue sky is too intense for you, you can retreat to LinkedIn. So
the summoning the gods of the old left is just gone.
Yeah.
Or what does it turn into?
So, the political analysis is just the scope of the Republican victory this time, right, was not only winning, but it was also winning the popular vote and winning both the Senate and the House. And by the way, also, having the majority of the Supreme Court from before. So, sort of all four of the formal branches of the government, kind of being taken all at once. And so I think it's a big shock. And then obviously just the arc of Trump coming back is a giant blow to a lot of the old psychology. And then I think, so I've kind of two thoughts on this, the surface level one and the deep one. So surface level one is just I think things just went too far. And I think kind of everybody knows that things went too far. A lot of people just know things went too far. And so people ended up with basically indefensible positions, like that basically there shouldn't be a border and the criminals should be allowed to run wild. It's just not, people should be allowed to just, be set fire to in the subway. It's just not I think a lot of people are trying to dismount from that. So that's one. And then the specific thing that's happened as a result of that is the Democratic Party over the last 6 weeks is immediately starting after the loss has basically descended into what I think is accurately called a civil war, where they themselves are trying to figure out basically what the path forward is. And you have, you have the current chair of the DNC saying we need to go even harder left. You have people like Rahm Emanuel and Richie Torres and others saying, no, quite the opposite. We have to come back to the center and come back to common sense. And so, I would be suspicious that it's a plot and that they're about to jump out at the inauguration or something. But I think in reality, I think Democrats are having it. Certainly, all of my friends who are Democrats are telling me that there's a very sort of severe internal kind of fight that's happening. And by the way, this in American politics, this has happened before. In my lifetime, this happened in 1980, which is when Jimmy Carter got beaten by Ronald Reagan, and the Democratic Party basically went into a paralyzed state where it tried to figure out whether to go, even more extreme to the left than it had in the 60s and 70s, or kind of come back to the center. And by the way, it took them 12 years to win another presidential election, which required coming back to the center. But it took them 12 years to do that. And I think a lot of my Democratic friends are basically trying to say, how do we shortcut that process? So I think that's part of what's happening. But I think the other part of what's happening is it's actually, I really believe this. I think a lot of what's happening right now is basically the effects of all of the censorship And so you have basically these sort of elites that we're talking about, this managerial class, the sort of, people who have been in power for the last 4 years in particular, people who have been running large institutions. They got used to being on the side of censorship, and they got used to wielding censorship as a tool against their enemies in the form of these sort of things like, again, Orwellian things, hate speech, misinformation, so forth. There's a big obvious problem with censorship, which is it's a violation of literally the American way of life. It's a violation of the principles of Western civilization, of everything that makes our society great. This idea you're going to basically prevent other people from speaking. So there's that. But I think there's actually another problem with it, which is it actually causes you, the way I describe it is it causes you to mount a denial service attack on your own epistemic ability to understand reality. Right? Like if, in other words, basically, if you have the ring of power that basically says you can define anything contrary to your current beliefs as hate speech and misinformation, then you will never receive valid counterarguments to your own views.
Yeah.
And then sort of that's the sort of intellectual equivalent of taking a hose, hooking it up to the exhaust pipe of your car and jamming the other end straight into your mouth, right? Which is just like, you're just going to breathe your own exhaust forever. And if you're only breathing your own exhaust, if you're only believing yourself, right, and people who are like you, and you're never listening to contrary information, right, because it's hate speech or misinformation, it's been censored, then there is no limit to how crazy you can get because there's no governor, right? You are not required to stay in contact with reality. And so I think the censorship basically regime worked for these people for quite a while. And then starting probably, 3 or 4 years ago, it actually stopped working. And it's led them into a set of policies that are just bananas. And so a big thing that I think that they really have to do is rip off the Band-Aid and stop with all that and get back to being, get back to being able to mark your beliefs to market, right? To reality, just like every business person has to. Will they do that? I don't know. But I would say they're in the beginning stages of that. I certainly hope they do it. It will be obviously much better for us as a country if they do it. I know a bunch of Democrats who are, I think, very smart and very strong and who are, working on this very hard. And I hope they succeed.
Well, I even see AOC doing some listening and learning to, about what happened in the election. And, she's going to have a kid and maybe she moderates a bit. At the same time, the pro-Luigi Mangione faction, the pro-killer, that sort of sentiment doesn't make one excited about the future of the party.
Full socialism plus murder in the streets. I'm just going to put it out there. Like, it might not be the best electoral platform,
right,
for 26 and 28. I don't know. Call me crazy. Maybe I'm out now to step with the mood of the. Plenty of people on X tell me I'm out of step with the mood of the people, but like, are the adults of any age going to step up and basically say, no, this is not who we are. This is not what we're going to do. And it would, and in many ways, it would be the easiest and most obvious thing in the world to do. And then it's just this question of whether they can kind of reorient.
Yeah. Well, and I just want to point out just how quick this vibe shift has happened. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, there was this big debate in our circles about the Curtis Yarvin view and the Chris Rufo view. And the Curtis Yarvin view was, hey, the conditions are not present. I'll let you edit the characterization, but basically it's don't fight back. You'll just lose, and you'll empower them. You'll make them stronger by sort of being the sort of counter opposition or controlled opposition. Whereas the Chris Rufo view was like, you can just do things. You can change laws as it relates to, what's happening in schools, as it relates to critical race theory, or as it relates to sort of the gender and sex education stuff. Like, you can have incremental gains and they will be meaningful. And Kurz are saying, no, they won't be meaningful. They'll change the terms, but they'll still have the same people in power and thus have the same views and make you think you've won, but actually you're, even further behind. Why don't you sort of edit that, or the characterization of that debate, and then talk about how that's evolved? Because my read, you can edit, is I thought you were more on the sort of Curtis side of that issue of like more sort of skeptical of innovation, but then at some point shifted to more of the Rufo view of like, wow, things can actually change sooner than we think. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So I think that's a great description. I think to give the strongest possible version of Curtis's view, which he calls the clear pill, I think that the key kind of in there that you alluded to, but let's draw it out, is not just that if the conditions aren't right, you will lose. It's that if you step up to be an opponent in a situation where you can't win, you're not just losing, you're becoming what I think he calls the agonist in a chemical reaction. You're becoming the fuel that the side you hate uses to burn even brighter. Yeah. Right. And so you're becoming you're making yourself into the bad guy. Right. And the sports metaphor is the Harlem Globetrotters, spent 40 years winning. They won 12,000 basketball games against their opposition team, the Washington Generals, which won 0. Actually, the Wikipedia page is really fantastic because it turns out the Washington Generals they accidentally won one game, and just accidentally, like a ball went in the basket at the last minute that shouldn't have, and like Meadowlark Lemon, who was the star of the Harlem Globetrotters, like just apparently completely lost his shit. It was just like insanely angry because, right, of course, that's the thing that's like never supposed to happen, and it was like super mad and like threatening to fire all the Washington Generals. And so, if you're up against the Harlem Globetrotters and they have institutional control, you don't want to be the Washington Generals. Like, you're wasting your time, you'll probably get vaporized, and you're going to make the opponent stronger. And so basically don't do that. Obviously, the Chris Rufo opposition to that is, okay, in that case, you basically just are signing up to lose, and what the hell, right? How can you basically do that? Why don't you get out there and fight and figure out a way to win? And, these are both incredibly brilliant guys. They fully articulated this. I would just say this. My partner and I went out on a limb to get involved in the political process, but a lot of that went well, by the way, including, candidates we supported in both parties, people in the sensible middle with the pro-tech agenda, pro-innovation agenda, which apparently now includes the former Commerce Secretary. Like, who knew? Miracles are happening every day. I wonder where she's been. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
We can talk more about that. We did that. The thing, though, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to just describe what's happening. I'm not going to claim that I'm some moral hero here or whatever, because I certainly don't think I am. And I think there's a lot that I could have done better in the last decade. In a lot of ways, I was ineffective. But I will say, like, I have been in pitched arguments on some of the topics we're discussing tonight over the course of the last, several years, in some cases with high degrees of intensity. And basically, I had become the Washington Generals. I felt like the Washington Generals. I was just like, I got to the point, even through this year, where I just felt like, I'm going to make the token argument, but like, I'm just going to lose. I'm just going to lose. And I lost over and over and over and over and over again in these discussions. And then basically after November 6th, all of a sudden, like a significant number of people basically are like, oh, okay, let's do it that way instead. I'm just like, what? Like, my arguments haven't gotten any better, right? Like, I'm not any more compelling. But people, it's what we talked about earlier. Basically, people are basically flipping. They're flipping on a lot of these issues really quickly. Of course, I give them credit for it, not myself. But it definitely feels like all of a sudden things are happening today, and I think we're going to see announcements, from various companies in the next 3 months that I think are going to be, actually quite surprising. And so things are happening that are, I think, put this under the strict Yarvin principle, they would not be happening. And so I think we need some other model of change, of which the preference falsification one is certainly the best one that I know of.
We'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. In an age of AI and big data, your personal information has become one of the most valuable commodities. Data brokers are the silent players in this new economy, building detailed profiles of your digital life and selling them to the highest bidder. With data breaches happening frequently, these profiles aren't just fueling spam. They're enabling identity theft and putting your financial security at risk. But what if there's a way you could opt out of that system entirely? Incogni is a service that ensures your personal data remains private and secure. They handle everything from sending removal requests to managing any pushback from data brokers. What I trust most about Incogni is how it provides ongoing protection. Once you're set up, it continuously monitors and ensures your information stays off the market. Want to extend that peace of mind to your loved ones? Incogni's Family and Friends plan lets you protect up to 4 additional people under one subscription. Take control of your digital privacy today. Use code UPSTREAM at the link below and get 60% off an annual plan. Again, that's incogni.com/upstream. Hey everyone, Erik here. In this environment, founders need to become profitable faster and do more with smaller teams, especially when it comes to engineering. That's why Sean Lenihan started Squad, a specialized global talent firm for top engineers that will seamlessly integrate with your org. Squad offers rigorously vetted top 1% talent that will actually work hard for you every day. Their engineers work in your time zone, follow your processes, and use your tools. Squad has front-end engineers excelling in TypeScript, React, and Next.js ready to onboard to your team today. For backend, Squad engineers are experts at Node.js, Python, Java, and a range of other languages and frameworks. While it may cost more than the freelancer on Upwork billing you for 40 hours, but working only 2, Squad offers premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost, without the headache of assessing for skills and culture fit. Squad takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Visit choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Of course, Curtis himself, I don't think has accepted. He's a hard person to get to change his views, or has a high standard for what FDR 2.0 looks like. He wasn't impressed when Elon took over Twitter. He said, "Oh, it won't happen enough." And obviously, he's very brilliant, but just interesting to
Well, he wants, to his credit, like he wants real victory. And so anything short of real victory is basically just giving your enemy a chance to retrench and come back at you. And let me say also, like, at least I don't think I know how it's going to play out. Like I have found my political predictive skills not that great over the last decade. So look, it's entirely possible that it's possible we're still the Washington Generals, and it's possible that basically everything that we've been fighting against comes roaring back. It's also possible that basically everything just moves on and there's some totally new set of issues. It's also possible, who knows, right? And then, by the way, if there's one thing that we've all learned, I think, in our lives and careers, it's, X factors matter a lot. Over the last 20 years, there's been at least 3 like really profound reality altering events that have taken place, which is 9/11, the global financial crisis, and COVID. And each of those was like a fundamental reset to a lot of assumptions. And so I've also learned to have a healthy regard for the unpredictability of the world we're going into. We do what we can.
And it seems like the X factor for the vibe shift was Elon buying Twitter, which almost didn't happen because he almost didn't go through with it. And if that didn't happen, then we'd all be sort of, just in the group chats complaining.
Well, it's even better. It's actually, you'll recall this, but it's even better, which is not only did he almost not buy Twitter, they actually forced him to buy it.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, but how angry basically everybody got that he was, quote unquote, trying to get out of the deal, and how the judge basically in Delaware, sort of the activist judge, basically, demanded that he close the deal.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the part of it that like doesn't get told, is like they absolutely demanded that he close the deal. And so anyway.
Yeah. That's really funny. Elon basically gave air cover to the vibe shift, both in terms of buying Twitter, but then also his own sort of evolution. And I think I'm curious, basically, if you could briefly touch on the role of group chats and how they played a role in the vibe shift over the past 5 years. Because I sometimes see Elon tweeting stuff, whether it's about testosterone or crime or even Michael Brown, like stuff that I saw in the group chats like years ago. He's sort of speed run this education. And I know he talks to you. I know he talks to a bunch of other people as well. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the role of these group chats in kind of the vibe shift. Because what we see in public is the antagonism that Elon received from government officials, but it seemed like he got help in getting up to speed and educated on a lot of these, and opening his eyes to a lot of these issues. What do you have to say there?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting backstory to this. So, Elon for a long time was actually, much like myself for a long time, he's what you just call a normie Democrat. And in fact, the origin of Tesla, the sort of great mission of Tesla was solve carbon emissions, climate change, right? Shift to a carbon-free economy. And so, he was not involved. He was not involved in politics. He was building his companies, which were certainly plenty hard to be a full-time focus for him. And so he wasn't really involved in politics, but he was always very curious about culture, and specifically, he was always really curious about internet culture, right? And so he was always tweeting and memeing. I mean, the two people who were like tweeting and memeing like all the time, basically 10, 15 years ago, when basically it didn't have any political salience at all, were of course Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Like literally, right?
Yeah.
Like Trump's Twitter feed going back into the if you go back before 2013, which is when everything kind of activated politically on the internet, like Trump was tweeting away and Elon was tweeting away. And so Elon got, super into internet culture. The specific proximate event that caused him to actually pull the trigger on buying Twitter was actually not a partisan political thing. It was literally the Babylon Bee, which was his favorite, satire site getting deplatformed, right? So the way he thought about it at the time, I think, was it's striking at the thing that I love, that I love. And he once said, somebody finally figured this out and asked him in some interview, and he said, he's like, this is, what do I do for fun? They'll be like, I work all the time. I spend time with my family, my kids. And then basically I when I have a spare 20 minutes, I tweet memes. And I remember thinking like, okay, wow, that's interesting. I should spend more time tweeting memes. And then I saw, and I had known Elon for a long time, but we had never worked closely together. And so I had always followed him and was watching what he said. And he one day it came out on Twitter, he tweeted something to the effect that he has meme dealers, right? That there are some number of people out there basically who are like arming him with memes. And that's how he's coming up with all these funny memes. He has meme dealers who are like dealing them to him. Yeah. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if I could become one of Elon's meme dealers. And so I started sending him memes and he started tweeting them. And I was like, this is freaking amazing. This is just like absolutely outstanding. Because when he tweeted it, he would get 1,000 times the likes that when I tweeted it. And so I was like, okay. And so he's been immersed in this culture. And as you said, like it's sort of a back channel culture, right? Right. So basically for people who haven't tracked this, basically what's happened is as the sort of censorship and cancellation machine kind of kicked in a decade ago, basically what happened was that we all organically, across many actually walks of life, many different kinds of of people created basically the modern equivalent of what in the Soviet era they called samizdat. And for those of you who don't know the history of Soviet totalitarianism, samizdat was basically underground newspapers. And so there was harsh formal censorship from the central government. And so there were literally these mimeographed at the time. Mimeograph is the copying technology before photocopiers. They're mimeographed basically newsletters. And these dissident writers would basically write samizdat, distribute it. And if you got caught with samizdat, by the way, it was a big problem, right? And you could get arrested or jailed or killed. And so basically the modern version of samizdat is, and by the way, here's how seriously they took that, just to give you a sense of how totalitarian regimes think. In the USSR through the 1980s, it was a capital crime to possess a mimeograph machine, right? So if you had a machine in your basement that was capable of running off copies of a piece of paper, you could get executed for it.
Wow. And
so they knew how important it was to maintain total control of content communications. And so the modern version of that is basically the WhatsApp group or the Signal group. It started out being the text chain, but very quickly became the WhatsApp group or Signal group. And the reason it became the WhatsApp group Signal group is disappearing messages, right? God forbid you get caught with the mimeograph machine. God forbid you get caught with a WhatsApp group, right? And in fact, there are cases both in the US and I know there's a bunch of cases in the UK where people have gotten really hung up legally for literally the contents of private WhatsApp groups, right? Like this is not, again, it's the soft authoritarian version of what the Soviets had, but it's, they do come at you if they find you have a secret WhatsApp group. And so that started to develop. But then the running joke became basically, therefore, as a consequence of this dynamic, the theme of every WhatsApp group was to basically send memes that were as edgy as possible, like right to the point where your friends literally would all like leave the group, but like not one step further, right?
Yeah.
As sort of a form of social revolt, right, against this increasing level of censoriousness in the public sphere. So what's happened is this sort of archipelago of WhatsApp groups is lit up, and now this is a universal thing. And in fact, like for example, we found out in the UK after all these COVID hearings afterwards, and it turned out basically the UK government for years now has been run on WhatsApp groups. Like this has become like a standard thing that people do a lot of business on. By the way, interestingly, this cuts directly into a key policy topic, which is the war on encryption. And, the authorities, both in the US and in many other countries, have been trying to prevent strong encryption from proliferating into the hands of normal people, for basically my whole career for 30 years. I've been fighting it in various ways for 30 years. But there was there was one turning point moment where Signal implemented true end-to-end encryption, and then in the context of groups and with disappearing messages. And then there was another sort of seminal moment where actually WhatsApp, which is actually built on the Signal, I think it's built on the Signal encryption technology, but WhatsApp, Mark Zuckerberg made the policy decision to also implement those same features in WhatsApp. And this is like, I can tell you, and it's been publicly reported that there's been intense pressure from governments to not do that, right? There's like a tremendous aversion on the part of these centralized governments, these centralized authorities, to basically make sure that citizens don't have the ability to really communicate in private groups without being able to be surveilled. The Signal folks deserve, the Medal of Freedom for carving the path on that. And then, quite frankly, this is an area where I think Facebook has done 100% the right thing by holding the line on that against tremendous pressure. So anyways, it just so happens that we actually have these digital technologies that actually make this possible now. And I to your point, I think when the history of our time is written, it's going to turn out that these groups are actually very important. And then, of course, people are going to like whine and complain because it's like, oh my God, like all these terrible people are having all these private conversations. It's like, well, no shit. Like they're having all the private conversations because they weren't allowed to have the public conversation, right? If it hadn't been for all the censorship, all these conversations would have just been had in public, which would have been like much better, right? But they weren't allowed. And so they were all driven underground. And what did you think would happen? And I think that's sort of been a key mechanism for the unwind of the preference falsification.
Right. Yeah, I remember when one of our groups started in 2020, June 2020.
Wait a minute. Wait. I just want to be clear, Eric. I don't know what groups. I'm not in any of these. I'm not. I just want to be clear. I am not in any of these. We don't know each
other. Yeah.
I have only heard about this from friends. I myself only communicate one-on-one and barely even that. So I just want to disclaim, just to be totally clear. I don't know you. I don't know your name.
Exactly.
I certainly don't have your phone number. Okay, go ahead.
Me and other friends, not you, June 2020, I was basically having activist uprisings in my company. I saw that 10,000 medical professionals said it was okay for people to protest during George Floyd, but weren't allowed to go to their grandparents' funeral or whatever. And I was had to say certain things on social media, and I could go to these group chats with maybe 5 or 10 people and just ask, hey, is it? Am I crazy? Or is this crazy? What's happening here? And not only could people tell me, no, you're not crazy, this is a crazy time, but also, and we could sort of laugh at all the crazy times that were to come, but also there was like a education happen. There were these antibodies being built, and then gradually the support for pushing back. I remember, Mike Solana and Balaji as some of the earlier people that were able to push back, and then the sort of preference falsification went from there.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I mean, it's a time-honored thing. It's basically you need groups of people to be able to get together and actually have open discussion. You always need, in every society, you've always needed that. It's always the catalyst for change. If change is ever going to happen, it's how change happens. It's absolutely crucial. But by the way, like I've read the Constitution, like it's actually something we are allowed to do.
Yes, yes, exactly.
We are allowed to freely speak and associate, and that's why. Right? I mean, that's the core fundamental reason why those rights are literally the First Amendment to our Constitution. And so it's been great. Yeah, I think it's an incredible, unalloyed positive good news aspect of this new technology.
And then now those same chats that were 10 people are now hundreds of people, and now you're tweeting again, and now it's just glorious. It's Glory in America, Morning in America. Which, going back to 2024, imagine there's a Twitter files for government, or imagine Elon does a Twitter file. Like, what do we expect to find?
Yeah, so first of all, again, I don't want to in any way speak for the new administration, but I would not be remotely surprised if that's exactly what happens. And of course, being the government, it will be spectacular. Like if it happens, it will be amazing, right? And the reason is just, and the reason if it happens, the reason it'll be so spectacular is just the government just has so much power. Yeah. It's actually been in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things that happened in the last 10 years, and people, of course, have lots of different opinions on. But like one of the things I think people should think about, I try to keep in mind, is just like sometimes you actually need a civics lesson. Like sometimes you actually need an applied lesson in civics. It's all the stuff if you grew up in the U.S., you of a certain generation, you were in social studies class, and they taught you how all this stuff is supposed to work. And then you go out in the real world and you're like, oh my God, it doesn't work like that at all. Right? Like that's not even remotely what it works like. But that's what we were told in school, how a bill becomes a law and all these other things. And every now and then you need an applied lesson in social studies. Like you need to see how these things actually work. And I think what's happened is that the government, for reasons that we could talk about at length, is just it aggregated just enormous amounts of power, and particularly enormous amounts of power when it chooses to implement this kind of soft authoritarianism and repression. And that the two most, maybe three most vivid ways, four that have played out over the last decade is, just you take them right off. It's censorship, it's debanking, and then it's, DEI, and then it's the whole constellation of ESG. And just this application of just incredible force to mandate these things, often in the face of, actual federal law, is amazing. And then my other thing is I don't know what exists inside the government files, but I do know what came out in the Twitter files. And I do have a pretty good sense of the kinds of things that exist in other companies. And I think the nature of these managerial organizations is people just can't help themselves but talk freely about these topics. They internally, right? They lull themselves, I think, into a false sense of safety that they can, basically freely talk about censoring their political opponents, debanking their political opponents, breaking civil rights law. They just start to think that these things are fine, and then they need to implement the directives. And so they need to actually do all the work. And to do that, they need to communicate, and they need to be compliant, which means they need to document their decisions. And then they need to do, document retention. So they need to hold on to all the documents, right? And so what we learned in the Twitter files is that there was just extensive written records of all of the bad behavior, and not sophisticated, clever, oh my God, I can't believe how smart they were and how they did all this. Instead, the opposite. It's the most cartoonishly malicious version of it that you could possibly imagine. Right. Just the dumbest possible things of whatever was in the New York Times that day was just believed absolutely uncritically and applied with just the greatest, just blunt force stupidity, over and over and over and over and over again, and then documented. And so I suspect that, for example, the debanking files, if we get this new administration chooses to subpoena the banks and then also chooses to open up the files at the many different federal banking regulators, because there's at least 8, which is amazing in and of itself, but there's at least 8 involved in regulated federal agencies involved regulating the banks. I think if we get all those internal files relative to debanking, I think it'll shock our shoes off. Number one, at the pervasiveness of the practice. And then number two, just the sheer ham-handed idiocy of it. This is not going to be the sophisticated version. This is going to be just I cannot believe that these people this crude in their own views were allowed to basically exercise their own personal biases with the full force of government power and banking cartel power behind them.
Yeah. Let's paint more of a picture of what winning looks like over the next few years. Or if you could wave a wand and change and have the administration do anything, what are some examples of things that might look like? One just example for inspiration is, I think at one point you said something like, if a few hundred people, we could wholesale replace them, that would, or get them out with generous retirement packages, et cetera, that might have a massive change. Why don't we just paint a picture of what winning could look like?
Well, I think there's, two big steps, honestly. I mean, step one is just stop doing stupid shit, right? Just stop with the stupid stuff, right? And so if there's just flat out relief like in a lot of ways, it's always like, it's always like this whole thing of like, why are you becoming involved in government? What do you want? And it's like, I don't want anything. I want the opposite of things, right? I want the opposite of something happening. I want whatever has been happening to not happen. And like the default form, right, of change is like, just simply stop. Like, for God's sake, just simply stop, right?
Yeah.
And so just stop this. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of these things, all these different, kind of crazy things have been happening that we've been talking about. And so that's one. And then, look, the other would be an actual proactive, positive, productive, proactive strategy, which, clearly they're developing and I think we'll put in place. I think they'll do both of these. But the simplest way to think about it is just what the president has always said and what he'll be saying a lot from here on in, which is his line, well, I just want America to win. Like, I just want us to win. I just want us to be strong, and I want our enemies to fear us, and I want to not get like screwed with. And like, I don't want people like taking hostages of our people or our allies, and I don't want wars, and I don't want those things. But then I want America to win. I want America to be like the strongest economy, to be the strongest technologically, the strongest militarily. I want maximum freedom. I want people to be able to live and succeed in their lives, like all these things. And so having a regime that is actually focused on the success and flourishing of the actual population of the country, and not trying to solve, every other problem in the world, and not trying to manipulate and orchestrate every social outcome. It is this amazing alignment. I mean, one of the really remarkable things is, there were people years ago, one of the sort of unusual things about what's happened politically in the last year is it's not the most obvious thing in the world that kind of the techno-libertarian faction would align with sort of a, what you might call a nationalist populist faction. And it actually turns out that, the alignment's not 100%, but it's shockingly close, because what both of those perspectives have is basically, let's go win.
Yeah. Do you think politics is downstream of culture or the other way around?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. The argument, the Richard Hanani and others argument that basically laws also drive culture in particular. Like, there's politics, but then there's laws. Yeah. And I think one of the things I've been trying to wrap my head around a lot, as we've discussed, is kind of what have been the roles of actual laws kind of every step of the way here. So, and I think maybe for those of us who aren't lawyers, I think people like myself, I think maybe we just persistently underestimate the importance of the actual laws. And so that's one. But I mean, look, the argument for culture driving politics is, I think, very strong. As we talked about earlier, political views have a cultural, social component like any other form of fashion and like any other cultural phenomena. And, they're just like music or anything else or clothing, like they're, things go in and out of fashion. By the way, patterns repeat. I saw bell bottoms are coming back. Yeah. Right. But they repeat in a lag. Like, they repeat when everybody forgets why they didn't like them. Right. And then they kind of go through that same process of rediscovery. And then these politics seem to play out on a generational time frame in the same way that culture seems to play out in a generational time frame. And you have this concept of eras that's never quite totally right, but like has a lot of substance to it. And so I think there's a lot to that. And then, maybe the sort of smartest thing you could say about it is politics and culture very clearly are kind of combined at the point of the media, which means politics and culture very clearly are combining at the point of social media. And social media spreads culture and politics equally and then in combination. I'm really struck. I'll give you an example. I'm really struck. Our friend Catherine D has this great. She's an analyst. She's an internet writer and thinker, and she's an analyst of. She started out being an analyst of what she calls fandoms. So fandoms is like Buffy the Vampire Slayer fandom, right? And I remember when these actually first started on the internet, because they first started actually in news groups, and so you'd have like alt.tv like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and then all the Buffy the Vampire Slayer fans would get together and they'd have these flame wars and these big arguments, and they'd have their fan sites and their all this stuff. And if a character died, they'd all grieve, and then they would be sending furious email campaigns to not get the show uncanceled and all this stuff. And so this concept of a fandom. And then basically Catherine's kind of big thing is like, it turns out everything else is also now a fandom, right? And so the way we now relate to politicians is as fandoms, in basically the exact same way. And we either like love that guy, right, and we cheer him on and we're part of his fan club, or like we hate that guy, like and our fan club wants to take his down. Right. And look, group formation, group psychology, even battles in the street are, that's been the case of politics forever, is kind of group formation and then the groups fighting. And so there's some of that's not new, but her point, which I think is very valid, which is on the internet, the similarity or the overlap with that and any idea of cultural formation, basically, they basically become the exact same thing. Right. And so I think basically from here on out, they're absolutely like inextricably connected.
And so for the people asking, how do we transcend that, et cetera, how do we get past that? Is that just missing the point, or not even wrong, or just naive, or?
That just means losing. I mean, that just means losing. But it's like bipartisanship. Like, what does bipartisanship means? It means that you're signing up for your side to lose. Like, a bipartisan Republican is somebody who just does what Democrats want, which is why the press is constantly pushing for bipartisanship, right? In the eyes of the press, the ideal Republican is somebody who just does what Democrats want. That's like bipartisanship. Like, never goes in the other direction. And so, I don't want to be in that fight is equivalent to saying I'm fine with the outcome. And fair enough. I don't know that politics, I'm not certainly advocating politics should consume everybody's lives. And I certainly hope it doesn't consume mine, but opting out, like if there is a fight to be had, opting out is the same as losing.
Well, too late for you.
Yes. Correct.
We're not interested in politics, but politics is interested in us, as I say. To the point, if 2013 to 2024 was the sort of wokeness era, what's the next cultural renaissance? Is it patriotism? Is it meritocracy? Is it normalcy? Like, what do you think will define the next era culturally?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's the new, the way I would describe it. Yeah. So the culture, for the first half of my life, the culture basically was the culture of the 50s, kind of extending into the, the 80s or 90s, which was the cliche, but the cliche of kind of Nixonian social conservatism, traditional families, all these aversion to social change, also all the things, the sort of hippie movement and the new left and the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s did their best to tear to the ground. And so, do we have our hair super short and neat, or do we have our hair long and scraggly? And that's a statement of our political beliefs and what culture we belong in. And so that was sort of the culture, counterculture, kind of thing that I grew up in. And I of course, just always assumed the counterculture was the correct one, right? Because who would want to be part of the dominant thing? You obviously want to be a rebel. And then, the other kind of thing you can always see, I think, in this culture, counterculture kind of thing is the side that is winning is the one that uses censorship, right? And so when I was growing up, it was the right that was using censorship, right, in the 80s, right? And so all the censorship campaigns were right wing, and the left, which was the counterculture at the time, basically kept saying, no, censorship is anti-American, right? And we need to be able to have free speech. And then the other, kind of clue of culture versus counterculture is who's funny, right? And of course, the culture is never funny, right? Because the culture is totally serious, right? The culture is absolutely the way things are and can never change and can never, ever be the subject of a joke, right? Which is the most threatening thing in the world to somebody in power is humor, is a joke, is being ridiculed and undermined. So the counterculture is the funny one, right? So therefore the phenomenon of a Saturday Night Live or something like that, which was which was irreverent. It was irreverent and funny because it was challenging the dominant culture. And especially if you go back and watch the original Saturday Night Lives from the 1975. I watched the very first one a while ago just to see it. I'd never seen it. And literally it's like what they used to call it. What was it? They had these terms like sit in, and then I think they had I don't know, what was it, love in, but it was literally it was like a circular thing. Everyone was just all hippies. It was just 100% hippies. And then they're basically sitting, it's a circular stage, and they're literally all sitting around with their legs crossed as these young kids come out with all these irreverent counterculture jokes. Of course, in our time, we could debate when the inversion happened, but it certainly happened by Obama and probably before that, where it flipped and the counterculture became the culture.
Yeah. When Stephen Colbert stopped being funny or Jon Stewart stopped being funny.
Yeah, when that kind of comedy went from there's actually a term when it went from laughter to what they call clapter.
Yeah.
Right. Actually, comedians talk about this. There's two responses. There's two responses to comedian on staging from the audience. One is you can get laughter, and the other is you can get applause. Yeah. And if you're a real comedian, you always want laughter, and you're horrified if you ever get applause. Because if you see applause, it implies that you have said something that basically where you want approval from the audience, and basically, right, where you're appealing to the dominant norms, and the audience is rewarding you for your compliance to the dominant norms.
Yeah.
And so, a real comedian is horrified when he gets he just wants laughter. And of course, the thing that generates laughter is something true. Right. Yeah. The thing that generates laughter is something true. The thing that generates applause is something that everybody is required to agree with. Right. Those are the opposite concepts. Right. And so, when late night comedy, such as it is, or what it is, it used to be referred to, went from laughter to clapter, the humor drained straight out of it. It became basically state media. It basically became state media. Right. It became basically reinforcing every night the set of the preference falsification, the set of things that you must believe, the set of things you must say, even if you don't believe them. And then certainly attacking people who say things that should not be said. And so this incredible, they have become this incredible mechanism of cultural enforcement, quite regime media. And it's amazing, by the way, it's amazing because it happened to literally all of them.
Yeah.
Right. It didn't happen to one of them. It happened to all of them, right? At the exact same time. That's what all the newspapers turned into and all television news turned into, right? And every university, right? And every foundation, they just all went straight into this lockstep. Anyway, so long-winded way of saying, now we're in a very interesting spot, right? Which is, okay, I always think the question behind your question is okay, now for the next whatever period of time, what's culture and what's counterculture? I think it's going to be really interesting to see, if the left gets really funny again, it's going to be a sign of a couple things. One is this going to mean that the right is ascendant, right? So the right is becoming the culture again, and then the left is going to respond with humor. And so maybe that's the thing to look for, is when when Saturday Night Live gets funny again, that will be a significant turning point moment. So that's one. Is that going to happen? I don't know. I think there's going to be to your point, I think there's going to be a big swing here for a while of a much more, there is now already, obviously, patriotism, American flags, pride in the country,
right.
By the way, veneration of the military, by the way, veneration of the police, pride in law enforcement, pride in civil order. And then obviously, coupling that with, obviously pride in free speech, free association. And not having to lie. And so that, there'll be a lot of that. What will that be balanced by? I'm not sure. By the way, will that go too far? Are we going to be sitting here in, out of 5 or 10 or 15 years saying, oh my God, we've reverted back to 1982 or something. And it feels like this crippling monoculture in the other direction, kind of back to that. I don't know. I kind of doubt it. I think maybe the internet. I kind of doubt it. Number one is like, we kind of had that. You don't tend to get the exact same thing again. And then the other thing is like, look, the form of media itself has changed. And so, this is like a classic line of Marshall McLuhan, which is, the culture is shaped not just by the content, but by the actual medium itself. And what we think of as like 1960s through 2000s culture was very determined by the specific form factor of television. And that's never going back in the box, like ever. Actually, somebody made an argument on X the other day that I thought was very striking. I forget who it was, but it was very bright, and said, there's a case to be made that 2020 may have been the all-time peak of top-down authoritarian message control for the rest of time. Right? You mentioned like what that felt like, right? Like how intense that felt, and we all lived through that. But the argument this person made was that was the point when, number one, TV was actually still relevant. Like TV still mattered, which clearly is like collapsing right now. Like TV was still hanging in there. And then the other was the internet censorship regime was still fully intact. Right. Yeah. So this is pre-Elon buying X, and it's when the government was just like doing their full-scale censorship campaigns and forcing the social media companies to censor. And basically the argument goes that in the last 4 years, both of those basically preconditions for that level of sort of thought control have collapsed. TV is never going to recover. Like, it's on its way to zero, right? You see that very clearly now in the ratings. And then the internet is never going to get re-centralized the way that it was before. It's always going there. It may come under more pressure in the future than it's under now. Like, there may be more censorship in the future, but at least the theory goes, certainly it's not going to get back to how crazy, how ruthlessly effective the sort of crazy censorship was in 2020. So I don't know, maybe that's a white pill, which is whatever we're going to get. It won't be that.
I remember we've been laughing about this sort of, I think it's a South Park clip. Maybe it's a Netflix executive. They're sort of, showing one of the shows that they're creating. And then someone is saying, put a gay woman in it or put a black woman in it. Just sort of a parody of kind of the sort of pandering that these networks have done. And, we've talked about sort of the Silicon Valley vibe shift. I'm curious if there is or might be a vibe shift in Hollywood. And I know you're obsessed with Hollywood and enjoy, sort of movies that portray how messed up, sort of sanctimonious but hypocritical Hollywood has been. Do you see any sort of self-awareness there or just, spiraling?
Yeah, no, I see a lot. So I should start by saying I actually have a lot of friends in that industry. And I say that because I'm going to refer to things that people have told me behind the scenes, and I just don't want any specific person to get blamed for it.
Yep.
So these are, I'll just give you the gestalt view, but I do talk to people in that world a fair amount. So one is, I think they went even more over the top on all this stuff than we did in tech. Like, I think it got even more extreme. And I think that you can see that in a whole bunch of ways, but the clearest way is the quota system. The DEI quotas got even more extreme. And so the major studios, if that's even possible, the major studios literally put out statements of literally 50% quotas in all these jobs, both in front of the camera, behind the camera. And again, I just a surface reading of that is those are all completely illegal, but they didn't hesitate for a second when the fashion became to put them out. The quota systems and all that stuff became very extreme, and then obviously the content changed radically and became very kind of ideological and politically loaded. So that went very over the top. Behind the scenes, essentially, at least in the last 3 years, I think most of the people in positions of responsibility behind the scenes in private basically think it went it just all went way too far. Yep. And they were saying that a while back. And I think part of that is just, they were kind of aware of what had happened and they didn't like it, but they didn't like the consequences on the product that they make. And then also part of that is things just started to fail. It's like one thing to make, a bad movie or something. It's another thing to make a movie that loses money, right? In that system, legitimately so, because these things are expensive to make. And there have been a long run now of high profile projects that have tanked very badly for, what certainly look like reasons related to what we're talking about. And then you've also had these anomalous successes. And so the big one, of course, was the Top Gun sequel, which was just this stratospheric home run, which is basically as direct a 1980s throwback as you could possibly get. And just a good old fashioned, unabashed, pro-American, patriotic, pro-military, America's a source of a form of moral good in the world, like competence, merit, hyper-aggressive people being incredibly ambitious and doing great things. Like, it just as sort of contra the current times as you can get. And it was this giant hit and everybody loved it. And so there's that. And so about a year and a half ago, the sort of word went out, maybe 2 years ago now, it's been a little bit, but the word went out. The code in Hollywood for the last couple of years has been dad shows or dad movies. And you've probably seen some of these. And so it's like the Reacher show on Amazon is like an example, or the other one is with the Terminal List, the really dark Navy SEALs show, I think also on Amazon. And so dad shows has been like a double meaning. It's something that you can say because you're like, well, dads are a market segment. And so we need to, the streaming services try to appeal to all market segments. And so we need to go get the dads. But of course, what it means underneath that is not woke.
Right.
Right. Because the dads don't want they don't want the lectures. They don't want the preaching. What they want is like to see like a guy going around like killing bad guys, like good old fashioned right-wing entertainment. So the call has been out for a while for that. And so it's like amazing because you have these projects where you're still seeing the trailers hit now for the projects that were like greenlit over the course of the last 5 years, where the projects are coming out now. And you can just literally tell it's like, 2019, 2022. You could just tell like exactly when the thing was written and pitched by the politics. But you're also going to see, I think, a lot more just, straight up entertainment. Bob Iger is obviously grappling, Disney's in crisis because of this. And this is Bob's public statement since he came back, which is, we just need to be in the business of entertainment. We just need to like make shows that people want to watch, which is funny because like in Hollywood 2024, that's like a radical statement, right? That's like a heretical. And everybody, by the way, and that's code, right? For non-woke. And everybody knows that. He can't actually say non-woke. Like he can't admit that the term woke even exists as far as I can tell. Like these guys can't. They can't actually talk about the thing, but they can use the code, right?
Yeah,
and
like,
so
they're 2 years behind us. We couldn't talk about it a few years ago, but yeah.
Yes, exactly. So yes, the Doppler effect is real. By the way, that's another thing that I think is, you mentioned cultural changes. That's the other thing I've been thinking a lot about, the Hollywood thing is an example of, which is this is going to sound very hubristic, but I think it might be true. And I hear this a lot from my friends overseas, which is I think it might be literally true that San Francisco is the cultural center of the universe. Like, I think like San Francisco was first in on everything that we're talking about. And I think San Francisco maybe is first out.
Yeah.
Right. And then Hollywood immediately followed, and Hollywood was going to work their way out. And then the rest of the East Coast, it was then, came in after that. It's going to take them longer to get out. And then whatever happened in the Southeast or whatever is going to be on a lag after that. And then the UK is going to happen 2 years after that, and Canada and Australia, right? And then it's, ultimately.
So you're bullish it's going to happen even there? Those places seem so hopeless and.
But on a lag. So the strong form of the theory is take any principle, take any of these preference falsification things, take anything that everybody was absolutely required to say, despite knowing that it was not true, and just identify the date at which everybody in San Francisco decided that they believe that, and then establish that on a timeline, and then the date when that same belief was taken up in all these other locations as sort of the wave spread. Okay, and then you've got like a stack rank of like places over time. And so the prediction would be the unwind happens in the exact same form.
That's funny.
Right. And so there's going to be like schools in like rural Louisiana, like 8 years from now, that are going to like get the memo, and all of a sudden nobody's going to have purple hair anymore. Right. It's just going to be like this incredible long reach lag, depending on your cultural proximity to San Francisco. Right. I don't know if this is all literally exactly right, but I'm very suspicious that this is how it's going to play out.
Fascinating. Well, you see Elon just recently supporting some of the sort of similar movements in Europe. Like he's not just trying to change what's happening in America, but also, similar movements around the world, which I guess was similar to what Bannon was doing maybe 8 years ago, or kind of, there's a similar sort of populism or whatever you want to call it. And it'll be interesting to see if there's enough momentum and energy in Europe for it to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of, talking to a lot of friends of mine in Europe, there's a lot of similarities. And so I do think like this Doppler effect, I was talking to a friend in Sweden, actually, so a few years ago. Actually, it's after 2020 is a friend in Sweden. And he said, yeah, it's weird. He's like, all of a sudden in Sweden, we only talk about American politics. Right. It's like everybody's completely obsessed with the 2020 election. And he said, like, literally it never happened before. Like this is not what they did in 2016 or 2012. Nobody had an opinion. Nobody in Sweden had an opinion on Mitt Romney.
Right.
They probably thought he was a perfectly nice guy. It just they were focused on Swedish politics.
Right.
Right. And he said something changed around 2020 where basically the narrative throughout Europe became American politics. And so this is the theory of these sort of cultural bow waves. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot to that. Now, the circumstances are different. I mean, there's a bunch of ways that we could talk about the differences that are important, but I think there's some some similarities to it. And then I would say, like with respect to what Elon is doing or work that we might do as we get involved in policy issues outside the US, the other just very practical thing is the US is not an island, and many other countries actually, I mean, first of all, many American companies are multinationals. And so if you're an American company, if you're an American car company, you are selling cars in Germany, and like what happens in Germany actually matters, right, for your business. And they may do things that are very destructive that you have to try to influence. Having said that, there is also something that has become, I think, an even more pernicious pattern that is actually, I think, developed into a real problem, which is the other countries, and this specifically is the UK and then the major countries in Europe and the EU, they now fully think that they can regulate US companies directly, right? And so they now think that they can pass these laws and they can enforce these laws in a way that it will force global change on the part of the US companies. And they do that for, on a lot of tech policy, these AI laws. It's almost impossible to believe, but literally the people who rule Europe came out a couple of years ago and said, we now recognize that Europe cannot become the innovation leader in AI, so we therefore are going to become the regulation leader, right? Right.
Oh
which at first you're like, okay, that's clearly insane, because like if you don't have any AI and if you pass laws to drive it out of Europe, which is what they've done, anybody who's any good at AI, with only a few exceptions, people who are any good at AI in Europe are leaving and coming to the US, because it's just the AI Act just made it impossible to function there. On the one hand, it's like, okay, you might view that as self-destructive, but they do have a point, which is they do say global leader, which is like, okay, if you're an American company and you want access to Europe, like you have to enforce these policies. And first of all, companies are not necessarily going to enforce different policies by country. They often end up just doing lowest common denominator. And then two is Europe increasingly just asserts that they have the ability to regulate for the world. And a great example of that is antitrust, mergers and acquisitions, which is if you're trying to do a tech merger of any size right now in the US, you also need sign off from the UK competition regulators, and you need sign off from the EU competition regulators. And so you have three primary regulators. And by the way, any one of them can veto an acquisition, which is one of the reasons why acquisitions have all but stopped in tech. It's like, even if the US regime doesn't do it, one of these other ones will. And they are like fully activated to punish American tech. I mean, they're extremely angry that the tech companies are all in the US. And they've just, over the last several years, just really been out for blood. So anyway, point being, like, because the critique Elon's already getting is how arrogant / inappropriate for an American like Elon to get involved in German politics. It's like, that's one way of looking at it. The other is Germany and the EU chose to become involved in American politics and have chosen to do things that are relevant to all of Elon's companies, no question. And if they don't want people like Elon showing up in Germany, maybe they should reconsider that.
Yeah. Just while we're on the AI topic, that was segue back. Do you think OpenAI should be allowed to be a for-profit?
So this is one of those things where you kind of always wonder if there's sort of two realities. There's two Earths, and you wonder which Earth you're on. Because like on Earth 1, there are very clear laws on this, and this has to do with federal tax law and among other legal regimes. And there are a lot of different ways in which somebody can inappropriately sort of cross the line with what they do with the economic value of a nonprofit. And, historically, in the US, when you cross those lines, you go to jail. Somebody who absconds with or hijacks or misappropriates or inappropriately leverages a nonprofit for personal wealth, that's like a absolute, like, put it this way, you or I do it, we're going to jail.
Yep.
Right? Like, I hope our friends visit us, we're going to be in jail. Then on Earth 2, it's like, maybe you can do whatever you want. right? Yeah. And like, YOLO. Right? And like, why not? And if you don't like your this or that or whatever, you just go ahead and do it. And who knows, see what happens. And I think this is one of those. Right. So, I'll just give you the very specific thing and not just, I'm trying not to get too specific on OpenAI, but just in general to your question, like the idea of a nonprofit becoming a for-profit, there actually is a legal regime in the US through which that can happen. It does occasionally happen. The usual scenario, by the way, historically is at hospitals where they start out as nonprofits and then at some point they become for-profits. And the way that happens is you have to create a new for-profit company de novo from scratch. And then you have to raise money to buy the assets in the nonprofit at their fair market value. Right. And so if the nonprofit owns a hospital that's worth $100 million, then to turn that hospital into for-profit, you have to create a for-profit, you have to raise $100 million and buy the hospital. And then at least in theory, that you're now clean when you do that. By the way, the people involved in the nonprofit very much cannot be the recipient of the money on the other side, because that would be, again, a sort of absconding, with corporate resources, with the resources of the nonprofit. But you can do that so that those transitions can happen. But, hypothetically, if you had a nonprofit that was worth $150 billion, it raises this interesting question, which is, number one, do you need to do any of this, or can you just YOLO it? But like, if you're going to try to do it by the book, do you basically create a new for-profit and then do you go raise $150 billion in cash? right, to buy that thing out, right? Or, do you try to figure out some theory under which it's actually not worth $150 billion, even though, like what's it worth? And then again, you're right back in tax law territory. And then again, the third rail is 100% that you can't, none of that money can go to you. And so this is a really good test. It's going to be a good test for the IRS. By the way, the California State Attorney General has oversight over this. There's a variety of, this is a potent enough topic area with enough just nonprofits. There's always government scrutiny on nonprofits because there's all kinds of ways that people try to siphon money out and they get the tax break. And so they're actually quite sensitive to this, and a bunch of different branches of state and federal government get focused on this. Then there's the other thing, which is whatever happens here will be a precedent. And the precedent is actually quite interesting because if, let's just say hypothetically, there's a YOLO and the YOLO works, it will set a very interesting precedent because, and again, just think basic incentives. If Andreessen Horowitz could instead, because we fund all of our companies, it's actually really funny. We call them unintentional nonprofits.
When they don't make profit, yeah.
Like they're Delaware C corporations. They just, they're not technically, you understand they don't make money. Yeah. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. They are legally for-profits and we invest in them as a for-profit. And, we invest in them using taxable money and the returns that come out of it are taxable and so forth. If in the alternate scenario, if we live on Earth 2 instead, what we would do is we would not do that. What we would do is all startups would start out as 501c3s, right? Yeah. And so you basically, and the reason for that is the funding then would come in and it would be a tax deductible. And so you would start a foundation that would basically make these things on a tax deductible basis. You get the tax credit for it, which would be much more capital efficient. And then if they don't work, it's just a charitable deduction that you've gotten the tax credit on. And if they do work, you YOLO and you flip it into being a for-profit, and off and away you go. The precedent that is going to be set here is going to determine potentially a lot of how basically startup formation happens and a lot of what people like us do. And, I would just let me hypothesize that I don't think there are very many elements in the political system that want people like me to be able to just nakedly evade federal tax law. And so I suspect that some of these things are not maybe going to be quite as easy as people might think.
And normally when you have an aggrieved funder who gave money to such a thing but didn't get upside, you would just settle and give him a chunk of equity or something. But when that person happens to be the wealthiest person in the world and also has started a different company in the space, perhaps there's no amount of equity or nothing that can be given that would inspire such a settlement. So it would be interesting to see what happens.
But again, I think that's all right. But again, there might be an even deeper problem. And I'm not a lawyer, so don't take this, for granted. I would say double check this with Claude before you make any legal decisions. But through Claude Esquire. But I'm not sure that I'm not sure they can just. I'm not sure that a nonprofit that has taken a tax deductible donation can turn around and settle with a chunk of equity in a for-profit.
Right.
I think that in and of itself might actually, I would be surprised if that were even permissible. And again,
unless we're in the YOLO world where it's whom and just
maybe that's a YOLO, right? Maybe every time I donate to a nonprofit now, I can hope that in the future some chunk of for-profit equity comes back to me. Why not? My mental model of the IRS is that they'll never permit this to happen, and the California AG will never permit this to happen. But it's like I said, maybe we need a good civics lesson now and then, and so we'll see. We'll see who's minding the store.
Going back to the vibe shift, one group perhaps that's either had the biggest vibe shift or perhaps even responsible for the vibe shift in some ways, and I'm thinking about Bill Ackman and his work on universities, is Jews post October 7th. And a lot of Jews, but not as many as I would have thought, started to support Republican administration for the positive work that they've done towards Israel when Trump was in office, and also in opposition to some of the negative work that the Democrats had done in empowering Iran and other things. But we also had this conversation a while ago, I believe even before October 7th, where it's not just about which party is supporting, but also there's this idea that some Jewish people are perhaps and Jews tend to skew, I think, more left-wing, at least in America, are perhaps confused because the very idea of Israel, to the extent that they're pro-Israel, the idea of a nation, for people, is perhaps antithetical to the left. And I thought that was an interesting argument for Jews who are kind of wondering how to think of themselves politically. Do you want to comment on it?
Sure. So to start with, just for clarification, I am not myself Jewish.
Yes,
I may be the least Jewish person in the world.
You're a Jewophile.
I am. I have a great deal of affinity.
Yes,
and many friends. I occasionally indulge in a little speculation and hope that my Jewish friends will be very forgiving and will cross-check me when I get things wrong. So, there's just been this incredible pattern. A lot of people have seen this, but there's just been an incredible pattern among the Jewish people I know. And I'll just start by saying American Jewish people I know, which is, I think, like a significant number of Jewish people I know after October 7th were absolutely shocked and horrified. Obviously, first by the attack in Israel, but then after that, shocked and horrified to discover the people they thought were their allies in the U.S. actually were not. And that played out maybe most visibly on the college campuses, but it also played out inside a lot of companies. And there was kind of this, sudden discovery that, kind of DEI as a movement is inherently anti-Jewish. In essence, by definition, it has to be for reasons we can talk about. And it turns out that it is. And it turns out a lot of the kind of DEI proponents are not shy about expressing that and making that clear. So basically, if people have been tracking this, whatever you saw, if you watch what happened in universities about a year ago, just assume that's been happening in a lot of other settings too. And so that's been a very, I think, rude awakening to a lot of people. We've talked about this is a debate that has actually happened inside kind of Jewish, let's say, intellectual and political society for a very long time. There's this famous Jewish intellectual policy guy, really brilliant guy named Norman Podhoretz, and he actually wrote a book like 20 years ago with this incredible title, Why Are Jews Liberal? This predates all of everything we've been talking about. And he actually went through this question and this argument basically in that book and basically predicted that it was just a matter of time until American Jews, and then also Israel discovered that basically the people who they thought were their friends were probably not. And the people who they thought were their enemies might well be their best friends. By the way, the other chart that gets passed around in samizdat WhatsApp groups is Pew Research did this incredible. Pew Research did, just normally it's kind of super woke, but every once in a while they do a piece of research that's like really revealing, and it's always never quite clear if they understand how revealing it is. They did this incredible survey. We should post a link to this. They did this incredible survey. They did a survey of religious groups in America about their opinions of other religious groups in America. And so, maybe this is like, I don't know, whatever, the ultimate Dave Chappelle skit or something, where it's just literally they segmented Americans by religion, and then they asked them what they think of all the other religions, right? And it's just, it's just like, wow, that would be amazing. And so they did this, and part of the humor of it, what happened is they had to be like very careful which religions they could include. So like there's all these like weird gaps, because there's all these like differences, because I don't know, I'm not even going to speculate as to why they made the choices. It's a subset of the choices, because they wanted to do a 2x2 grid, and maybe there were some more inflammatory topics in there. But they did the 2x2 grid, and then they expressed it with a numerically as positive or negative sentiment. Basically, what does group X think of group Y? What does group Y think of group X? Positive or negative? 0 is the baseline, and then positive 10 means favorable by 10 points, negative 10 negative by 10 points. And so it turns out that the one that's just like, I cannot stop. I laugh so hard I start crying it's Jews and evangelical Protestants. So there's two funny ones. So one is the Mormons just love everybody. The funniest one is the Mormons are literally positive on every other group. And then the other groups are like, not so sure. But it's just validation that the Mormons are like the warmest hearted people in the world because they're positive on every other group. Maybe so that's why I love all my Mormon friends so much. But the other thing is the XY comparison of Jews and evangelical Christians. And the funny thing is, Jews in America, according to this survey, Jews in America have a negative 40 view of evangelical Christians. And evangelical Christians have a positive 40 view of Jews.
So it's one. Wow, that's hilarious.
It's like the most polar, and it's by far, these are like the most polarized numbers on the chart. Like it's like an 80-point spread, right, in the two directions. And so literally, and I'm just going to cliche, I'm going to cliche here for a second. You've literally got, I don't know, Woody Allen in New York, imagining there's some redneck in Arkansas who just thinks that like Jews are terrible. And the redneck in Arkansas is like, I freaking love Jews. Like, there's no way. Like if you could get them all in a room together, I mean, I'm sure if you could get them all in a room together, they would all love each other so much. The numbers would all go to 100, but it's just this weird, it's just this thing, right? Yeah. And so anyway, so this is one of the, I think, great discoveries a lot of my Jewish friends have made, which is like, they're actually their best allies in American politics, both for life in America and also to the extent that they care about it, which many do, the sort of future of Israel. Their main ally is actually like straight up just a stereotypical Trump voter, like by far, right? Yeah. Like if they drove through the Deep South, everybody would love them, right?
No Nick Fuentes in the Deep South. There's maybe some online, anti-Semites, but there's like a tiny fraction of the population.
None. I was actually, I'll tell you another version of the story, a more serious version of the story. I was at and this again, it breaks your brain in terms of what you've been told all these years, but I was a guest speaker at the last Republican House offsite at the Greenbrier, North Carolina. So this is all of the Republican House members that go offsite, and it's a closed thing. There's no press. And so it's literally Republican House members, it's their spouses. And then it just happened to be, I was a speaker. So there were two speakers back to back. There were only two non-House members in the room, or spouses, which was me and then the other speaker, who turned out to be the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. And because we were both speakers, we were sitting at the front table, so I met him and talked to him for a bit. And so I got to see him give his talk in front of the House Republicans. And this is probably 9 months ago. So this is, obviously post October 7th, but everything is still tense, but, everything was like super tense back then as well. And he gave this incredible talk on what's happening in Israel. And it was the most palpable display of like uniform, unanimous love, like I think I've ever been in a room. Like the congressmen and their spouses, and one after the other got up and spoke, and they just like this tremendous outpouring of like, we love you all so much, and we're behind you, and we'll support you, and we'll do whatever you need, and tell us what. Like it's just this incredible level of like love and support. Obviously, and it's not obviously there are a lot of Democrats who are also very pro-Israel, but like this actually happened at the same time the university stuff was happening, and so it was such a stark kind of illustrative difference. And so I don't know, maybe this has always been the case. I don't know, maybe things are, tectonic plates are shifting. Maybe the whole DEI thing just got so intense that it kind of knocked this stuff off kilter. Another theory is, it's now been the last Holocaust survivors are passing away now. They're like literally in their 90s. And the last World War II veterans are passing away. And so, maybe there's a generational thing here, which is just the memory of World War II and the Holocaust is fading. And everybody's just naturally going to recalibrate what they think on things because they're not going to have that as sort of the foundational kind of memory of the creation of the state of Israel. So like this all seems very open. Now, as you said, like we have a lot of friends who, like Jewish friends who are, it's not like that all of a sudden they're like hardcore Trump supporters or something, but well, and let me also say, like, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, there are certainly some Jewish Americans who were not Trump supporters who are, or something like that. But also, I think it'd be great for the country. I think it'd be great if, if a fairly large number of American Jews also stay in the Democratic Party and help the Democratic Party kind of get back to sense. And so maybe that's the other thing that will happen.
Right.
And by the way, and I don't want to speak for any of these guys, but I think you mentioned Bill Ackman, but also Mark Rowan. Yeah. And these guys who became these sort of board members and major donors to these universities, we started to see the amount, we saw what it meant when guys who are that respected and are that significant to those institutions have the real power of moral weight behind them. Right. They can really start to change things. And so we'll see what happens, but maybe that continues.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, another perhaps diagnosis of why it was the way that it was is that, sometimes the people who are your friends aren't the people who you want to be your friends. So to use the Woody Allen example, like, yeah, maybe the redneck likes him, but he doesn't want his love. He wants the love of Hollywood. And, even if they're sort of, less pro-Israel or in that way. So maybe as the culture changes in the way that we were talking earlier about what's cool, what's high status, maybe that will influence things as well and make it easier to switch. One thing I also just want to comment, we talked about in our last interview a year ago, how SBF in a famous Tyler Cowen interview talked about how, because he's a utilitarian, he would keep taking the odds, double or nothing of, do you bet the world and even risk it all if there's a positive EV? It feels like in his own way, Elon has done his own version of going all in multiple times. Of course, when he started his companies, going into debt and taking immense risk on all of his previous gains, but also most recently in the election, there was that interview with Tucker Carlson where he was joking, if Trump doesn't win, am I ever going to see my kids again? Or what's going to happen? What's going to happen to me? Are they going to try to take me in jail? Just, was he taking a massive risk? And what do you make of his behavior to just keep going all in and just keep betting?
Yeah, so, the joke online has been that this is obviously not his first time through the sim.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. This is like Bill Murray and Groundhog Day having there are all these calculations online for how long Bill Murray was repeating days in Groundhog Day and online. And it's like the consensus, it's like if you add it all up, it's like 30,000 years. Yeah. And he's just been like running every experiment every day to kind of see what works best. And so it looks like he's doing it effortlessly. Yeah. And Elon's kind of the same thing, which is just like, at least for the last several years, it's just like everything he touches works. It's been an extraordinary run. You know how it started. I mean, Peter Thiel talks about who worked with him at PayPal, talks about how when Peter said he was going to write a book at one point about the PayPal experience, and he said the chapter about Elon would be called "The Man Who Knew No Risk." Right. He's just like flat out, just like missing the risk gene. Like, I don't know though. I really struggle with that because there's this real question around like taking risk, because like you take risk every time you like step out into this across the street. It's like take risk. This is sort of conventional view is you roll the dice and maybe it goes one way or maybe it goes the other. Like what the great founders tend to do, and you're like that, and I'm like that, and I think everybody we know is like, yeah, when you start a company or try to do a new thing, like there is risk, But what you spend all of your actual time doing is trying to take the risk out.
Right.
Right. And so you are trying as hard as you possibly can to figure out all the different things that can go wrong and all the things that are inadequate, for the challenge ahead. And you're trying to like get in front of those things and fix those things before the risk kills you. Right. You're trying to take the risk out. And I often, Andy Rachleff taught me years ago this idea that I call the onion theory of risk. This is his idea, but I can't remember if he came up with the name, but it's sort of the idea basically is you can think of a company as like on day one, it has every possible risk, right? And so it has team risk and product risk and market risk and pricing risk and margin risk and competitive risk and regulatory risk. And then basically what you're trying to do as a founder, like one of the ways, the conventional way of thinking about what you do as a founder is you're trying to like get things done and hit milestones. But the other way of thinking about it is those things, if you're doing it right, they're peeling layers of risk off the onion. And basically success in a startup, one way to think about it is when you've eliminated all the risk. Right. Yeah. You figured out something to do that solves every single one of those risks. And so, and we often analyze companies this way. And so, one of the things that Elon is really, really good at is doing that. He's really, really good at, he identifies stuff for team risk. Okay, I'm just going to go hire all the smartest people in the world. So it's like, okay, can we ship the product? Well, I'm just going to hammer, I'm just going to be involved every step of the way every week and make sure that we ship the product. So is the product going to be good? Well, I'm going to be the guy who beta tests the self-driving thing. And it's, the new software patches are going to download to my Tesla first. And right, every single thing. Or, the government is threatening to regulate me out of existence. Oh, I know. I'll go, I'll go do what I'm doing, with the new government. And so, a way to think about it is it's the reverse. He's actually reducing risk every step of the way. And I think that a plausible telling of the Elon story in the fullness of time is that, each of the things that he does over time with his companies and now more broadly is everything about it is taking away layers of risk from the ultimate goal. And by the way, the arc there is particularly compelling since the ultimate goal is quite literally Mars. Yeah. Right. And so the way to think about it is what if, think about the arc as basically the goals to get to Mars. To get to Mars is it's every possible risk in the world for doing anything. Right, getting to Mars. And so how do you strip away all those risks, right? And so how do you, okay, we're going to need to like build a lot of stuff on Mars. How do you do that? Well, we need robots. Okay, we're going to do that. How do you need, what's going to control the robots? We need AI. It's just step after step after step after step, you're taking risk out. And so I think, ironically, he might be one of the greatest risk reducers at this point in history.
I love the tweet about how it would make more sense for John Galt to take over the government rather than just concede it and go to some other country.
So Atlas Shrugged, which, by the way, so Atlas Shrugged is this incredible. So Atlas Shrugged, so to start with, I actually didn't read Atlas Shrugged until like 4 years ago. It was weird. When I was a kid, this is the truth. When I was a kid, I read The Fountainhead, and I was like, all right, it didn't resonate with me at all because it's all about like artistic integrity and like Hardbrook gets like basically pissy over artistic compromises and like burns down his own buildings or tears down his own buildings. And I'm like, well, that's absurd. Like, no, that's not. So it didn't resonate. And then I always heard about Atlas Shrugged. I never read it. And then my friends kept telling me, no, you need to read it because we're literally living it right now. I was like, all right, fine. And so I started the audiobook and I would just sit for hours and it's just like, it's so incredibly vivid, the story that it tells. And now I understand the negative reaction that it gets, right? Which is it is just absolutely unabashedly pro. To start with, it's pro-America, right? Which is, of course, enough to get it critically condemned forever. But it's unabashedly pro-capitalism. It's pro-enterprise. It's pro-industrialism. It's pro-energy. It's pro-building things. It's pro-merit. It's pro-trade. It's pro all the things that the modern academy literary establishment is against. And it's just an incredible painting of that. And then the other thing is just like utterly shocking is the degree to which the villains are all real. Yeah. Right. And I'm sure you've done this. Like you can just go down the Wikipedia entry of like the villains and you're like, oh yeah, I know that. I know Ellsworth. I know Ellsworth Toohey. And by the way, I know Ellsworth Toohey also. Yes, we don't have to say who it is, but we both have the same name in our heads. Exactly. And so I know these people. And then the two most amazing, the sort of equipoise of the whole thing, the two characters ultimately, one is John Galt, who's for people who haven't read, he's the great industrial genius who basically essentially goes on strike. He literally goes on strike and creates a whole separate, I'm going to spoil it. He creates this whole separate, world isolated out from the rest of the world called Galt's Gulch. And he sort of takes all the world's geniuses and pulls them out of society. And then, so that's one character. But the other character is do you remember this, Eric? The other character is the character of the United States president. Mm-hmm. And the character of the United States president, I might get the name wrong. It was a deliberately vague name, but it's like Mr. Johnson. Yeah. And the thing with the character of Mr. Johnson is because all of the characters in that novel are like incredibly vividly drawn, all the good ones and all the bad ones. Like they have these incredible personalities. They're larger than life. They're like these superhero like figures. The one exception is the president of the United States is Mr. Johnson, who's deliberately painted basically as a non-entity. Like he barely even exists. And like, he's basically just a figurehead of this just like totally screwed up system, this government that's completely out of control, that's like crushing private enterprise, just, trying to impose socialism, doing all the worst things it could possibly do. But the guy in charge is like the exact opposite of like a Lex Luthor. He's just like a complete nobody, completely interchangeable. And anybody else could be in that job. Mr. Smith could be in that job. It wouldn't matter at all. And every time he's in the novel, it's like he's not even a character. He's just like this complete zero. Right now, I don't know, just like hypothetically, this would never happen, of course, in our world for real, but just hypothetically imagine that someday we had a president where literally it's like he doesn't even exist. Like, is he awake? Is he asleep? Is he alive? Is he wandering around the West Wing in his bunny slippers? Like, who knows? Now, that would never happen in real life.
No, of course not.
No, but if it ever did, it would be this character in this novel, right? And so, like, her novels are so unrealistic, right? That would never happen.
Exactly.
And so, can't even finish a sentence. So, and everybody just lies about it.
Oh, my God.
So anyway, both of those characters, like, and maybe those characters, like, okay, but like, that's not like the president character might be real, but like the actual John Galt would not do what John Galt did. The actual John Galt would do what Elon's doing, right? The exact opposite of the John Galt plan. And I'm going to spoil the novel, like in the end of the novel, I'm going to spoil it. And it's actually very poignant, which is basically all the geniuses basically just go to Galt's Gulch and they basically go into seclusion and they basically wait for industrial civilization to collapse and for the rotten system that rules it to basically cave in, under the theory that then they'll be able to like come back out and sort of fix it properly and basically prove to the normal man that he actually needs, these sort of industrial super geniuses. And so it ends very poignantly with like literally the lights going out, right? Like literally the lights of New York, like to start to blink out, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's like, okay, like you could say like that's like really unrealistic, of course, except that's like literally what's happening in Europe.
Yeah.
Right. Like the prices of energy in Europe, price of energy, what is it price of energy in Scandinavia is like up like 20x this week. Wow. It's like you get these crazy things. And then the price of energy is so high in the UK and in Germany now that they're both literally Germany is deindustrializing, right? The price of energy in Germany is so high that literally they're literally shutting down the factories, right? And if this keeps going, if the trends continue, they will end up in rolling blackouts. And by the way, California, we have our version of that. We've been through, phases where we have our own rolling blackouts, which is remarkable. But it's like, okay, that's one option if you're John Galt. But the other option is, no, you just go do what needs to be done. And there's actually a character in Atlas Shrugged that actually does that or tries to do that, which is the Dagny Taggart character. And in the end, she's ultimately convinced by John Galt that she should actually also give up. But Elon's like the John Galt character that decided the opposite of giving up. He just decided to take on the bigger challenge to make sure the problem gets fixed. And I don't know. It's like, the old line used to be like the thing with Ayn Rand's novels is the heroes are fake, but the villains are real. And, that might be wrong. Like we might actually every once in a while get a Randian hero. And
to that point, maybe a couple points or a couple more questions will let you get out of here. But this idea of some people have said something like, oh, the Silicon Valley vibe shift is so hypocritical because a few years ago they were saying, get out of politics. And now everybody's, in politics. And I think the easy response to that is, well, a few years ago, sort of all this activism in our companies were destroying our companies. And now, or this past administration, all these sort of crazy, capricious, arbitrary, overbearing regulations were killing our companies. And so we're doing this sort of from the company's perspective, company best interest thing of, hey, let's get rid of politics in our companies a few years ago, but let's get more involved in the political system as a way to protect our companies.
Yeah. So look, I think you mentioned earlier, I've been quoting, there's an old Russian joke, proverb, Soviet era, which is you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And so look, I was in and out of politics in sort of the traditional light fashion, mostly as a Democrat from 1994 through to 2016. I won't do the long version. I just kind of assume you're just kind of a good person. You're a good Democrat. You make money, you give it away. Everything's great. So I was around it, but like never really centrally involved. And frankly, it didn't really matter. Like it didn't, your point, like it didn't really impinge on our companies that much. Like no, there was never a government policy about the router. Or the database, right? Oracle there were never hearings on Capitol Hill at Oracle saying, what data is being stored in your database, Mr. Ellison? Like that, it wasn't politically salient in that way. We all, or at least I just thought you could take it for granted that you could kind of be tangentially involved if you wanted to be or wanted to argue about immigration or something, but you certainly didn't have to, and you could spend your entire life being blissfully removed from it, and it was totally fine. And then, yeah, like to your 2 points, like basically like, no, it turns out politics is interested in us. And yeah, that took two forms. One is it took the form of this very specific kind of activism inside these companies that started to really wreak havoc. And then it took the form of an administration that just decided to be like extremely destructive. Like they just woke up one morning and they just decided to be destructive, and they just decided to do everything they could to try to wreck American tech and American startups. And I understand, like I try to channel the other guy's thought process, and I understand this sort of extreme kind of anti-markets, anti-tech, anti-free speech kind of ideology that consumed all these people. But like they really acted on it, and they ended up with a lot of power, and they caused a lot of damage.
Yeah.
And so this very much is like a war that was brought to us. And I don't want to speak for Elon, but I'm certain he, feels the exact same way. I'm certain this is the last thing that he ever wanted to do. He'd be much happier if he could spend all of his time working on Mars. But it turns out the road to Mars requires.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, it's actually really interesting. The Mars thing is actually really funny. It's very interesting, which is it turns out to actually get to Mars, there's only specific windows because of the rotation. The planets have to be in alignment. They have to be close enough where you can actually get there. And there's only a launch, according to Elon, there's only a launch window like every 2 years. And so a bad administration with bad policy can basically set Mars back 4 years very easily by just preventing those, 2 launch windows. Yeah. And so it turns out the road to Mars, requires going through the U.S. government. It turns out the road to flying cars requires going through Twitter.
Yeah.
Right. Like, flying cars, this last administration, basically outlawed the American drone industry and guaranteed that China would win. Right. This kind of administration that we've been living with is certainly never going to legalize flying cars. I mean, not a chance in the world. And so it turns out if you want flying cars, you also need an administration that's actually also pro-tech. And so it turns out, they promised us flying cars, and we needed to get 140 characters before we could get the flying cars. It just is what it is.
Yeah. Or to quote you from, 15 years ago or so, software ate the world. It started with all the parts that we could do digitally in the world of bits. But then once we approached the world of atoms, and of course some fintech too, we faced, regulatory headwinds that we weren't used to. And so in order to actually build our companies, we had to get much more involved.
Yeah, what shocked me so much over the last 4 years, which is Peter Thiel and I've had this long-running debate about, his thesis on innovation. And we actually kind of agree for the most part, or I would say I've come around to his point of view on most things. But I think what he would say that I would agree with is innovation in atoms has basically been made illegal over the last 60 years. Innovation in bits, good news, it was allowed to continue, but that's not enough. Like just having bits is not enough. I always tried to make the argument you could get more done with bits than he thought in thinking in the future about things like AI. But then, and then I just sort of assumed, and again, this is based on everything I had seen over 25 years or whatever of exposure to the government. I just assumed that the status quo of, all right, atoms are illegal, but at least bits are legal would just continue. And then these people decided to try to make bits illegal. And and again, they just voluntarily one morning woke up and decided to do that. And they came at bits in the form of crypto and in the form of fintech and in the form of AI. And then they were coming for the very foundation of even the software business model in the form of unrealized capital gains taxes.
Yeah.
And so, and at that point, if they're able to having eliminated innovation in atoms, if they were able to also eliminate innovation in bits, we're done. Economic growth stops, right? Society goes into decline. Economy, certainly stagnant growth will lead to negative growth. All politics for the rest of our lives are zero sum. The country becomes an incredibly impoverished, bitter place, and the lights start going out. Right? You just step by step, you can just project this forward. It's just crystal clear what'll happen, and it's literally happening in Europe. You can actually see it happening in Europe, and policy development for the United States has become very simple. It's do the opposite of what Europe does.
Right.
It's just shocking. It's like Europe is like a giant Jim Cramer, right? It's just just
Scott Galloway. Yeah.
Scott Galloway, Paul Krugman, just do the opposite. Just do the opposite. And so anyway, maybe amidst all the drama of the last year, maybe just that central fact is becoming clear. Maybe that's the turning point.
Well, maybe the last point I'll leave it. So one is a question, which is first a reflection, which is in the Barry Weiss interview with Peter Thiel. She says, hey, there's a lot of people who think that Trump has exhausted the A team from the last administration. What's left is sort of the C team and the D team. Is that true? And then Peter says, not at all, which is both a reflection of what he thinks of the past administration, but also the type of talent that's coming into office right now. And also add a question to that, which is FDR 2.0 the best analogy for what's possible, or what is the best analogy of what's possible?
Yeah, this has been a giant upside surprise. I assumed that the appointments would be good, but in the last 6 weeks, I've just been shocked at how good they are. Absolutely shocked, including, by the way, today, a whole run of appointments today that are just fantastically good.
It's half the group chat.
Yeah, exactly. And a bunch of people we wish were in the group chat. Yeah. So look, I think a couple of things. So I think one is, to the credit of the Trump team, there were a lot of young people in the first term between first Trump term, 16 to 20, second term starting now. In the first term, there were a lot of young people in there who kind of got educated, maybe the hard way, like under enormous pressure. And many of those people are now, maybe they were in their early 30s, now they're in their 40s. They're very spun up. They know what to do. They've been through the process. They understand how to get things done. They understand the kinds of ways people are going to try to stop them. And they have 10 years of maturity and they're ready to go. And many of those people are in there and they're really good. And then, by the way, there's another set of young people. There's another set of young people in their 20s and 30s, volunteers who've come in, who I've met, who are just extremely good, very sharp. Then there's, Eric, what you were alluding to, which is the people from the outside who are coming in. Pound for pound, like it's the best staffing I've ever seen. It's like light years. I mean, number one, it's like a million times better than the last 4 years.
Right.
But it's like better. It's clearly better than the administrations that, my first exposure was in the beginning of the Clinton administration. I've kind of been exposed to it since, and this is clearly the best team by leaps and bounds. I think you have to go back to the 1930s FDR, when FDR put out the bat signal and all these incredibly talented young people showed up and created and ran all these departments. Or maybe you have to go back, and I mean this seriously, maybe you have to go back to Lincoln with the team of rivals with these incredibly capable people. But even, just today, two of my partners who Sri Ramakrishnan and Scott Cooper, who are both amazing. And then who else was announced today? Michael Kratsios is amazing. Yeah. Emil Michael into defense. Steve Feinberg, by the way, one of the legends of private equity, an incredibly capable person going in to be deputy secretary of defense. I forget who, there was like three other just incredible people today. And then over the course of the last month, the people, Jay Bhattacharya going in around NIH and Marty Macri for FDA and
Jacob Hellberg.
You see, God, I'm so excited. Ken Howry. Ken Howry is the new ambassador to Denmark, I think. Yeah. And his specific assignment is to buy Greenland. So the joke online, Trump, variously has said we should buy Greenland, we should reclaim the Panama Canal, and then we should make Canada the 51st state. And the joke online today was, no, people are misinterpreting it. He doesn't actually mean that. This is just the art of the deal. This is his rope-a-dope, because what he actually just wants is to buy England.
That's so good.
Which, by the way, he just appointed, this is another thing, I think this is a genius move. He appointed a guy I actually know, Mark Burnett, who is literally the creator of reality television and literally the producer of The Apprentice, is going to be the U.S. Special Envoy to the UK. Wow. Mark being a Brit by background, long since Americanized, but one of the great and whatever people think about reality, like one of the great thinkers of business and media, and it's just like an incredibly brilliant polymath, incredibly capable guy. It's like a Mark Burnett is just at a level of firepower, just like way beyond the kinds of people who normally get pulled into these things. And then even people in the prior administration who are in some special roles. Rick Grinnell, I think, is the special envoy, I think, to Ukraine, I believe, or maybe to the trouble spots. He's amazing. Who else is in there? It's just this list. And then there's a bunch more that are in process, and if they land, they're equally good. And so it's, Michael Anton into the State Department. Yeah, Sachs, of course. David Sachs into the White House. And then who else into the State Department? This guy, Bridge Colby, into the State Department today, who's one of the best foreign policy thinkers of our time. Incredibly brilliant guy. Yeah, and so it's just like pound for pound, these people are just off the charts. So I no longer believe I can predict politics, but I cannot imagine a better team than this, and it's extremely exciting. Yeah.
Well, the note of optimism is a great one to end on. Mark, as always, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Good. Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you, Eric.
Upstream with Erik Torenberg is a show from Turpentine, the podcast network behind Moment of Zen and Cognitive Revolution. If you like the episode, please leave a review in the Apple Store. Hey everyone, Eric here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at ericaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.